Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about preparing for the bar exam as a foreign trained attorney. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox Podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about preparing for the bar exam as a foreign trained attorney. We work with a lot of different people in this category, and the challenges fall into a few different categories. So, Alison, what are some of those categories?
I think there are a few buckets. So sometimes there are language issues. Someone has not had English as their first language, which causes some specific problems and just makes things obviously much harder. And sometimes people have not studied all of this law. For example, if you've only done an LLM, or in some cases, you might not have done any education in the U.S., depending on your original system. So there's just a lot of stuff you haven't covered. You're going to have to get up to speed on. You might be coming from a civil law system versus a common law system. So that's just a whole different way of thinking about the law. So I think that can cause some unique challenges. And also the testing format here is just really unusual. I don't think most people who are trained outside of the U.S. have done multiple choice questions, for example, on the law. Sometimes people might have had oral exams in their previous studies. So it's just a very specific and frankly weird way of testing people. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. I wanted to go back to the English as a second language issue because I think that the thing about this issue is that it sneaks up on almost everyone, even if you've been conducting business in English. And I think sometimes folks who are fluent in English are surprised that taking an exam under these timed conditions in English is still a challenge. I think even for some law students for whom English is a second language, it can still be a challenge. So it's not to say that it's an insurmountable issue, but sometimes you do need to really focus on the speed at which you are writing, the speed at which you are reading, writing in clear and concise sentences. But if English is not your first language, don't discredit it, even if you've been conducting business in English, because I think it's surprising to folks how big of a deal that is.
I agree. And I think, like you mentioned, really comes down oftentimes to timing. You and I both tried to learn foreign languages with varying degrees of success. And the reality is, if somebody gave me a test in Spanish, that would be super challenging for me. It would take me much longer to get through that, to read and write. I mean, if I even could. It's just harder and it takes more time usually. So I think the timing aspect, particularly on the essays, can really trip people up. And that's where the performance test can also cause some problems, because it's a pretty decent amount of reading to get through. So you've got to figure out strategies to do this really efficiently, probably even more so than someone who does have English as their first language.
Yes, I think the time crunch is just going to feel like such a big weight when you start to do that timed practice. And I also think that the feedback I've gotten from foreign trained attorneys is also that they're used to perfecting their writing in English. They might draft something in English and then edit it or have it proofed, or they really want to craft language because they're working in English typically.
Right.
And so it's very important. But there's no time to craft language on the test. And so finding a comfort level with what your English writing sounds like at a fast clip when you don't have any time to proofread, that's also something that you have to practice. I think it is important to note that graders have communicated to us that they don't penalize someone because they make some grammatical errors, especially if they can tell that those errors are because you may not be a native English speaker. They're not going to use that as a reason not to pass you. However, you have to get stuff on the page to allow them to pass you. So you have to still raise the issues and have the organization and have the analysis. A typo here or there, or even a slight least strange construct of a sentence, that's not what's going to prevent you from passing, but actually getting stuff on the page. That's why the practice and the feedback on the practice becomes so important.
And I think, just to be clear, the timing is an issue for a lot of people who went to American law schools, did a JD, only spoken English their entire life. So it's not like this is a unique problem. But I think having to do this in a different language just adds that extra little of the twist. And I think you're
Yeah.
right that you have to learn to write very concisely. It doesn't probably sound great. It's not something you would submit in a work environment necessarily, but it just has to be very to the point because you're going to be very time pressured.
Yeah. And if you are an accomplished enough attorney to be licensed outside the US and then come to the US and do an LLM and sit for an American bar exam, it's not going to be easy for you to just want to put out work that you're not proud of. It's like
Right.
you've done a lot of hard things. So it is a struggle since most of us are perfectionists anyway, but it is going to be a struggle to realize that the worked product would not be something you may want to produce at work. That's okay. No one will ever see it. So you just need to pass the test.
The reality is the only possibility of you seeing your essays is if you don't pass. So
Yes,
if you do pass, you or
then
no one are ever going to see them.
no. I think even working with attorneys from the UK, where there is not a language barrier, I think has really highlighted for me how perplexing some of this US law can seem when you come from a different jurisdiction completely. When any of us take con law, there are some things, let's say the First Amendment, that are very messy. And I've had some conversations where the students will say things like, there's no way that's the law, right? Yes, it is. I'm like, everyone goes to law school in the US and is also confused, but is just told that's what the law is. And I think that the other thing you have to bring to studying is an openness to be confused a little bit, because if you didn't go to a US law school, you didn't take a semester worth of academics on a certain subject, trying to cram it for the test, some of it may be a little hard to conceptualize. You may need additional support to answer substantive questions because it's going to feel very different. Some US law is very unique.
And I think that's, as you said, in the UK, even coming from the closest possible system. But we changed a lot of stuff. We went a different direction on some things. And I do think that openness to having a level of confusion that you probably are not going to fully have resolved is really critical, because I think sometimes we see people really trying to go down the rabbit hole of, I need to understand the full scope of this topic. And the reality is you may have 2 to 3 days to get from zero to where you need to be on a topic. Whereas even during a whole semester, you might still walk away being like, that con law stuff, particularly now, who knows? But at some point, I think you just have to accept the reality of the world that you're living in for the bar and say, all right, this is what my outline tells me the law of this topic is. I'm going to try to understand the basics of what this terminology means. I'm going to work on applying it to some questions. And then you got to move on.
Yeah. And I think this idea of not necessarily understanding absolutely everything goes back to the perfectionist problem I was talking about. Nobody likes to go into this test feeling like they don't know everything. But the reality is, especially if you are working and studying and you are coming to this test as a foreign trained attorney, you may not have a ton of time to study. And we're going to talk in a few minutes more about tips for studying. But the other thing you need to do is to try and just grasp the universe, because it's possible, even if you do a great job of studying, that you're going to end up seeing something on the test that you don't know. And you're going to have to just understand enough stuff to try and make something quality up. And so that can be understanding some public policy behind some of our law. Some law it's very hard to do that with. But I was speaking with a foreign trained attorney in Hong Kong the other week, and we were talking about family law. And I said, yes, sometimes the rules of family law are tricky, but if you take a few steps back and you say, what are our core public policy anchors that we think about when we have created this law? We don't want divorce or dissolution to be something that is easy and that is beneficial to everybody. We want to discourage that. Okay, so what rules would discourage that? And then if we want to allow people to contract out of the family code, which is a prenup, what are we going to do to create safeguards? I think most people could come up with some options. Maybe everybody needs a lawyer, no undue influence. Maybe you can't be signing the paperwork in the parking lot. But I think you can also learn this law from a different place, which is maybe I don't need to know everything, but maybe I need to have a bit of an anchor understanding of the structure of it. And then if I have to make some stuff up, at least I could make a pretty good guess.
I think that's right. And even people who went to U.S. law schools obviously end up doing this. I 100% guarantee you I was making up law on the
Oh, I did.
California bar exam because I didn't have time to study. I was working.
Yeah, you've got to collect enough points. And that's really the key. So fighting this perfectionism and this idea that you're going to understand everything that's covered in every single subject, there's like a tension there. You also have to be comfortable with this idea that you're not going to learn everything in every subject. So you're going to need to be pretty good at reading facts, pretty good at issue spotting, and can get enough stuff on the page under the timed conditions to collect enough points possible in order to pass. It's hard. It's coming at it from a different perspective than you've likely done any of your other studies.
Right. So I was talking to a foreign trained attorney the other day about the idea of a domicile in civil procedure. And he was telling me, I have the outline and it has this stuff in it, but I really feel like I need to dig deeper. I'm like, you don't. You need to
Mm-hmm.
memorize that this is the rule for a domiciliary for a person. This is a corporation. They have two options. Move on. That's a level. If you know those two things, that's all you need. You don't need to like have a fundamental understanding of any of this. It needs to be like they're in a place and they don't plan to leave. That's close
Right.
enough, basically.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about kind of the struggles and the big problem areas for foreign trained attorneys. We've talked about running out of time on the test. We've also talked about writing coherently, but also needing to adhere to this IRAC or CRAC style, which is very U.S. specific. What have you heard from foreign trained attorneys about the struggle of using this formulaic type of writing?
It feels like a formula. It doesn't sound great. It's not very interesting. I think sometimes people think that they're following it, but if you actually read their writing, you're like, there's no rule here. Or whatever it is. And again, I think it depends on the bar because California might be more detailed on the analysis. They're longer essays. They're looking for something different than on the MEE where they want probably the conclusion up front and then your analysis, yes, because blah, blah, blah. So I think you need to really understand and become a student of the test and make sure that you are actually doing that type of writing, which I think can be very difficult for people to evaluate on their own. Because I think there's a tendency to go through your essay and say, hit the main issues. And that might be true, but you might also be leaving a lot of points on the table that you're not even aware of.
Yeah. And if you haven't gotten any feedback on how to write in the IRAC formula, it is just really hard to figure that out on your own. That's why law students often struggle in that first semester or so of law school because they've gotten limited feedback on this formulaic type of writing. I think it's also so challenging to handle the massive amounts of information. Alison, we've talked a little bit about maybe taking a step back and like the level of specificity that you need to study in. But what about focusing on heavily tested areas of the law, or do you need to know everything? Like, how do you maximize your time? Because who has extra time? No one.
And I think that's a really hard balance for people who are not trained in the U.S. system because to a certain extent, there are probably topics that maybe are less tested that you touched on in law school that you might be able to get away with not really reviewing that much because you took the class. If it's like a not really commonly tested topic, but you took the class, you could probably come up with something. But if you're a foreign trained attorney, you definitely did not take that class. So there's more information that you need at least some understanding of, and you have less background. I think the reality is most people need more time to study than they have, which might mean not sitting for that test and taking the next one or something like that. I think people really tend to underestimate how many hours they're going to need. But I think this is a really hard balance. I always recommend people start with some short outlines and add more if they need it versus starting with a really big, giant outline and trying to learn all of it. You're better off having that 10 to 20 page understanding of a topic than having zero understanding of it because you didn't get to it, or trying to learn 100 pages on every topic, which is just not feasible.
Yeah. I think this is also where it can get a little tricky when you're picking your bar provider because some bar providers, I've been informed, sell this idea that these programs are specially designed for foreign trained attorneys, but I do believe it is mostly just repackaged lectures that they give to U.S. law students, but you get access for a longer period of time. I think it's important to realize that those lectures are designed for someone who likely took the class in law school. And so they aren't going to discuss public policy reasons behind things. They're not
Right.
going to discuss the big picture. They're going to sit down and say, in evidence, there is hearsay, and then there are hearsay exceptions, and here's the list of hearsay exceptions. And they're going to just talk about each one of them. They're not going to give you examples. It's not going to be like that. And so you need to really understand what the different providers are offering you. And I agree. I think that starting from condensed outlines and adding to them allows you to see the forest through the trees. Whereas if you have these, huge out lectures, it can become so overwhelming with just the law that you need to pass. And I think that is really tricky. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're at the beginning of this process, you're trying to figure out how you're going to study, to really be thoughtful and try out different tools and see what is going to help you get to where you need to be, which is sitting for this test, not being an expert in all areas of U.S. law.
I think you just cannot possibly learn all of the material. You have to prioritize. We often recommend the Smart Bar Prep outlines. They are color-coded by priority. Something like that is going to give you a more realistic universe of this is what I really need to focus on. And then you have to start applying that material, because this is not a test of the law. It's a test of your ability to use that law convincingly and make us think that you are qualified to be an attorney. I think you can't just try to memorize everything or even learn everything independently of applying it, which, I think we're going to talk about in a bit. But even something like learning how to do multiple choice, that is going to require a ton of practice. And in the end, most of our foreign trained students actually do better on that section, because I think it's a more controlled universe. 7 topics. Once you've seen enough of them, you recognize the patterns, usually fewer reading and writing timing problems because you take out the writing aspect. But I think they can be really weird and confusing when you first sit down and look at them. So most people are probably not going to be getting these right for a while.
Yeah. And as we say in the rest of our podcast episodes, you need to do thousands of them in the best of circumstances. Foreign trained attorneys probably need to do more of them than that. When you think about the time that you need to study, you really do need that extra time to be able to get enough familiarity with these questions and start to see some of the patterns come through. So it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and sometimes I talk to people who didn't pass. They were like, I did so many questions. I did 500 questions. I'm like, that is not even in the ballpark of what you needed to be doing. You need to be doing a minimum probably 5x that.
Yeah. Yeah. What about the performance test? I love the performance test because you don't need to know any law. However, you do need to somewhat be used to the formula of some of the assignments that they ask for. So how do you think foreign trained attorneys should approach the performance test?
As we talked about earlier, I think the timing is usually what gets people here, and just not having a very good process. Sometimes people don't do these. They might not do any because they think, oh, I'm an attorney, I can handle that. That is a really big mistake. We've seen people who fail because of the PT, and that's really frustrating for everyone. You did all the other parts of the test okay, and then you bombed the PT. So I think just having a really clear process, being familiar with the different types of things you might see, understanding that you might see what we call the wild card, which is not a brief or a memo or something that makes a lot of sense as a standard assignment, but it might be something like draft articles of incorporation or write a closing argument. If you do get that type of assignment, they're going to give you a sample. So you just have to calm down, recognize that no one doing this is probably that prepared to write the specific thing, and then follow the instructions. I think that's so key on these.
Yeah, so much of what you're being graded on is your ability to follow instructions.
Specific instructions. If they give you a sample, your document should look like the sample in every level of detail, essentially. Unless they tell you not to do a piece, you don't do that piece. Sometimes I think people will just get nervous and start writing down all the facts and things like that when they might have specifically said, do not do a recitation of the facts, and you do it anyway, thinking, oh, maybe they'll give me some points. They won't. It's a waste of time.
Yeah, no, totally. All right, so we've covered a lot of details, but I wanted to take a moment before we go on to just pull it together. So foreign trained attorneys need to appreciate that there are 7 MBE multiple choice topics. And then there are also essay specific topics. In California, there are a very specific list. And for the UBE, as it currently stands, there's also a very specific list. You need to understand that list and make sure that you are studying the law that is covered in your jurisdiction. So that is also very important. Don't take books from somebody from California and plan on sitting for the UBE, because I know people pass around books. That's not going to help you. It could help you for the multiple choice portion, but not the essay portion. So that's really important to be aware of. I think you also need to remember that, like we said, you can't learn absolutely everything. So you have to be strategic. And that you really need to do the application piece, because you can still screw up the law and get a lot of points, but you can't get any points if you don't get that analysis down on paper.
Right. And I think that's something that people absolutely need to start from day one, literally day one. The first day, maybe day two. So day one, you can study a topic for one full day. But by day two, you need to be practicing. It might be you're doing an essay open book, but if you're not looking at what these essays are until 6 weeks into your preparation, when you're like, oh, I finally feel like I've learned some law, that's way too late.
Yeah, totally. So you've got to start as soon as possible doing that application and hopefully getting some feedback on it, whether it's from a bar provider, whether it's from tutors like us. Perhaps if you're an LLM, maybe the law school will provide you some resources. But you definitely want to engage whatever resources you can get your hands on to make sure that you're doing that application correctly.
Yeah, and I think this can be challenging because, like we said, people who are trying to do this as foreign attorneys have generally been very successful. You might not have needed a lot of outside help. You might be coming from a system where that just isn't really done. But the pass rates are not great for people who take this as a foreign attorney. So I do think if you want to set yourself up for success, it probably makes sense to get somebody to review your work, because otherwise you're not going to have any idea what you're doing wrong until you get into the test.
Yeah, and you can totally get sucked into just studying the law for months and months and months on end without doing any application. And that's just not the best path. I'd much rather see someone take those smart bar prep outlines and some essays that they pulled from our Brainy Bar Bank and identified some heavily tested issues and then struggled with it and tried to practice applying it and then evaluating your own work. That struggle is likely going to get you closer to what you have to do on exam day than just passively listening to lectures for months and months on end.
That's not fun, but it's frankly easy in a way. You're not exerting that much brain power. You feel like you're checking stuff off the list, but checking stuff off the list is just not going to get you where you need to be.
Yeah.
If you're in California, you can get sample essays from a site called baressays.com, where you can actually see this is a 50, this is a 65, and this is a 75, which I think can be helpful because the sample answers aren't necessarily realistic. They're like the very best answers. I think it's hard for people to calibrate to what am I really aiming for here? And I think that's a resource that can help you see what you're aiming for.
Yeah. I think one final thing about the time, really, you have to do it under time conditions. It doesn't matter if you could write the most perfect performance test in 2.5 hours. You have 90 minutes to do it. I think you really just have to focus on the time. And I think that can be so hard to be realistic about, but that is something you don't want to get lost in your prep.
And something like that, we have tons of tips for how to speed up your work on the performance test. Skim it, read it like a magazine. Here's what you're noting down on the sides, and here's how you keep track of things. This isn't necessarily rocket science. There's some pretty clear ideas and strategies that you can try out and see what works for you. But yeah, if you're writing it in 2 hours consistently, that's not going to do you much good, because then you're losing 30 minutes on some other essay and you're going to fail that essay.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked a little bit about needing extra time. So how early do you think that foreign trained attorneys need to be studying for this test?
I think this is tricky because we are recommending typically like a standard test taker, no accommodations or anything like that, is probably going to study for around 400 hours. I think you need at least 100 or 200 more. So if you're looking at like full-time 8 to 10 weeks being your normal prep, you've got to find that time someplace. So I think the issue is a lot of people, if you do an LLM, maybe you graduate in May and then you sit for the July bar. That's probably almost certainly not enough time. The reality is you either need to bop that out to the next exam, which could be challenging. There may be visa issues, all kinds of stuff. Or you have to start studying during the LLM, basically, which is not going to be much fun.
Yeah, I know. So you really need to sit down and look at the calendar, be realistic, talk to your job, especially if you're planning on starting work, understand what happens if you don't pass. Just make sure you really understand the whole picture. But I do think you need more time than most folks do. And again, that's not a criticism. It's just the fact that you didn't go to a typical law school here. You're not starting at the same place than a U.S. trained attorney is starting from.
I would also caution people, and if you're listening to this and saying, oh, if the average person needs 8 hours a day, I'll just study 12 hours a day and I'll do the extra time then. The reality is you are not going to be that effective at some point in the day. And you can try to cram all the stuff in your head, but it's probably not really going to go there.
Yeah. We really think that utilizing a tool like Adapt Bar UWorld is a great way to maximize your MBE study. I think you can try them out. They both have trials to help you decide which one works best for you. But those are great things to look into. You can often get access to them as soon as a bar season ends. So if you're studying for the summer bar, you can often get access in early March. And so if you were going to start studying early, that's one way that you could get some of those hours in. So it's important to ask questions and get access as soon as you can to start putting deposits in the bank for your study time. And then, like I said, make sure you get feedback from somewhere. And LLM programs are typically pretty expensive. So go to your law school and see what they're going to do to help you. But someone like us, or maybe your bar provider gives you some feedback, but you really need someone to validate for you that you're on the right path and help you troubleshoot if you're struggling.
And I just think it's honestly going to speed everything up, which is the goal here, to have somebody say, what you're doing is not working and here's what you need to do instead. That might save you weeks of effort of figuring that out on your own. And the same thing with some of the substantive law. Like you said, con law tends to be a beast for people. But if you have a tutor who can just say, okay, the key to con law is the levels of scrutiny or whatever it is. I'm going to give you the basics of federalism. Here's how the First Amendment works, basically. This is the freedom of religion stuff. That can be kind of boiled down pretty quickly for somebody who actually understands it and knows what you need to know.
Right.
Yeah, before we wrapped up too, I did want to touch on this question of the LLM because I think it's so interesting talking to people who've done an LLM who knew they were going to be preparing to sit the bar. Some schools, you take a ton of bar classes just as part of the program. Other ones, they barely require any. So I actually think
shocking.
It is shocking. I think it's a really interesting question that I was trying to sit down with and say, okay, assume my school doesn't really require a lot of bar classes. How many should you try to take and which ones? And even if we assume, say, 2 per semester, it gets interesting to say, what should those classes be? Do you have any thoughts, Lee?
If you really want to practice law in the U.S., I think you should take a couple doctrinal classes. It's like a good, solid civil procedure or criminal law if you are going to do something in that vein, or evidence. That's a pretty big, important one. Some of these big core classes, a lot of them are the multiple choice topics, so 7 core doctrinal classes. They're going to make all the other stuff a bit easier. If you understand the basics of contracts, secured transactions is going to make more sense if you study contracts, I think. I've never taken a secured transactions class, but that, based on my studying of the outline, is what I understand.
Yeah. And so if I'm coming from a common law system, you can probably skate by on some knowledge of basic stuff, probably maybe even contracts, certainly torts, probably property. Our system of property is very English based. Where it gets trickier are these statutory classes or classes that are largely based on things like the model penal code. And contracts in the U.S. can be one of those because you do have the UCC. So I think there's an argument for actually taking a contracts class, even if you know contracts. But yeah, I think evidence for me would 100% be on that list, probably Civ Pro. But if I had to choose between torts and crim, I would say go with crim because there you have the model penal code. It's more U.S. specific. I think it's probably conceptually a little more challenging than torts, which is pretty basic. And also, if you study crim, then you've covered some of the intentional torts, assault, battery, essentially. They're basically the same. But I do think it's an interesting exercise to sit down and say, what are the most critical ones that I would take?
Yeah. It is interesting that you can legally practice law in the U.S. without having taken many of those classes in school or not done an apprenticeship or done something like that. But it is the rules that we have. It's not to say that foreign trained attorneys aren't a great asset. Oftentimes, they come with a very specific skill set. That's one of the reasons why they were coming to work in the U.S. And so it might seem silly to take constitutional law if you are going to do a very specific type of international law that you have been doing in a different country and you're coming here to do. But I do think that there is something to be said about educating yourself in the system and the structure, especially if it's going to be at all linked to the work that you're doing.
Yeah. And anybody who's going to be a litigator of any type in any court is going to need to know something about the rules of evidence.
For civil procedure.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I would say those are probably two of the more challenging classes to do on your own. So even if you are a corporate attorney, I would say if you really want to pass the bar, probably worth doing. Yeah, I think for some people, they do the LLM, like, I'll take the bar and see how it goes. And other people come in really wanting to pass it. And if that is you, like, you need to take as many of these, particularly the MBE classes in your LLM program as they will let you take.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we're winding up. Any final thoughts for our foreign trained attorney applicants that might be listening?
I just think recognizing the challenge and coming at it in a way that's more likely to set you up for success. So what I don't like to see is people graduate from their LLM. They've taken 2 trial classes the whole time. They sign up for a big course. They spend their whole summer. I was in New York in the summer, and we had an LLM living with us who was studying for the bar. But basically, she was just watching these lectures all day long. I never found out if she passed. Doubt it, but you never know. But I think if you are going to give this a shot, I think my advice would be just approach it in a way that is probably going to get you closer to being successful, which might mean forging your own path and making sure that you're actually applying the material as early as possible.
Yes. And I think you need to be honest that this is a very challenging intellectual exercise for almost anyone. And even if you are incredibly accomplished at what you do, coming to sit for this test, especially in a jurisdiction where you did not go to school, is a big challenge. I've seen brilliant lawyers misstep on this test. It's not because they're not brilliant. They are brilliant. This is just its own thing. So to really come at it with the right mindset that you've got to learn how to play this game to pass the test, this really isn't a comment on your legal mind or what type of a lawyer you're going to be or the skills that you're coming to the table with. It's really about this test and getting ready for this one test.
I 100% agree. And I think if you can frame it that way, and I absolutely agree with you, I don't think this has anything to say about somebody's ability or intelligence or any of that. It is just a very challenging amount of material, and it is a challenging test. Even for people who are good at testing, it is a hard test. If it doesn't go your way the first time, that also doesn't mean that like you're a failure or you're stupid or anything like that. It's just this thing is a beast. And be realistic, I would say, about what you're getting into, but also know that people do pass all the time. And we've worked with a lot of those people. And sometimes it takes a few tries, but we've worked with tons of people who managed to pass this, not having gone to a U.S. law school, which is actually incredible.
Yeah, it really is. I think we are out of time, but if you'd like to learn more about how we have helped foreign trained attorneys pass the bar exam, you're welcome to reach out to us on our contact form on the barexamtoolbox.com, and we will chat with you more about our programming and how we support foreign trained attorneys. All right. And with that, I think we're out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or Alison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.